When we returned, girls and women offered themselves to us for a piece of bread, and our amorous adventures gave meaning to this pause before the fighting. Lithuania. We drove through a hilly autumnal landscape in October light. Serious and in pensive colours, the fields lay there, pale green and brown in muted tones. Broad-leafed woods died in orgies of red and gold, and gloomy pines slowly grew into the gloomy skies. Melancholy and sorrow blew in our faces. We, though, loved the quiet beauty of this world. Life drifted simply by. Tidy villages leaned against hills, wooden houses in plain gardens. A yellow river flowed amid gleaming streets, graveyards and ruins, copses and distant birches. The journey delighted us. Meadows and pastures surrounded Dunneberg in the evening light. Everything drifted past us, letting itself be seen, but not touched or held. We knew this world, yet we remained guests in it. We took no part in the destinies of its people, in the breath of the earth, in the growing and withering all around us. Vitebsk, Smolensk, Vyazma, and 1,000 other villages and hamlets remained cameos in the endless journey. Only the spirits of war gained in influence. Destruction and emptiness, solitude, nearness of fate, and readiness to die took us in. We no longer dreamed of necessity, and barely sensed the adventure of our journey. We thought only of the madness of war, the crime of the age, and no longer shuffled the stars for our personal destinies. We lived our lives surrounded by death. No more than that. And so we came 27 to the front at Arashev. Cool, showery days blew by with the autumn. Puddles filled with ochre-coloured water and became swamps, the bottomless mire around Rashev. Leafless alders stood in the swamps, pines and birches dripped with moisture. Soiled and mashed, the steppe grass lay on the ground. Murky streams flowed down soft roads. The earth was sodden. With every step our boots sank. A shower anointed us each time we pushed aside some fir twigs. We left our tents and set off to the trenches at Tabakovo and the fairy tale forests. Covered with mud, coated with crusts of dirt, in sodden boots and coats, we stamped through the mire. Everything was damp and foul, the bread as much as our clothing. Rust coated our rifles. The sun alternated with night frost and snow. There was no refuge from the rainy season. We found the trenches soft and often flooded. Water dripped into the primitive bunkers and the crude sentry holes, and the horses collapsed on the roads. A horse was more precious than a man, but we took our fate as it came, lived in our memories, and dreamed of a safe return home. Soon we became habituated to it, as though nothing had changed since the muddy season of the previous year. Only the landscape touched us more nearly. Alder scrub, swampy hollows, and hills with vestiges of woods manifested a melancholy beauty, shifting between idyllic wasteland and frightening barrenness. We re-immersed ourselves in the mysteries of the Russian soil. We no longer marched, no longer overnighted in villages and barns. For a long way behind the trenches, there was no house or barn intact. All that remained of Tabakovo were charred beams, bricks, gardens full of frost, spoiled vegetables, alders and streets. Beams and boards had been stripped and used in the construction of our dugouts. We lived in a kind of glorified rifle pit. A planked ceiling protected us against light mortar shells. A box stove afforded some warmth. We picked up firewood wherever we could. We were unable to wash, and the field kitchens in a remote ravine didn't serve us before dusk. But our serenity and calm stood us in good stead. Danger was normal, and what had once petrified us as we first set out now barely touched us. Mind and spirit accommodated the requirements of destiny. 300 yards in front of us were the Russian trenches, a dip in the middle and some wire entanglements. Rifle grenades flew across without interruption, whistling and warbling over our heads or exploding on the ramparts. From time to time a light mortar would sprinkle our trench and the abutting area. Snipers made every step out of the trench a race against death. We became indifferent and didn't know whether it was resignation or trust in God. We moved between the clay walls like funambulists, walking on duckboards and narrow metal grids over the mud. Many of us became ill through the cold and wet. The damp clay encrusted coats and blankets. The walkways sank in the water. We were unable to change our shoes or socks. We couldn't make a fire in the daytime because the Russians would use the smoke from the wet wood to aim at. Most of the rifle pits you could get into only on your hands and knees. A tarpaulin hung in place of a door. Days were an alternation of weapons cleaning and trench work, and at night we went out on sentry duty every 2 or 3 hours to stare into no man's land in case an enemy patrol appeared, and to wait whether a bullet hit us or a direct hit from a mortar spattered our blood and brains against the trench walls. Then the guts would freeze to the clay, scraps of cloth and flesh would lie around, and someone would come across vestiges of a comrade many days later and not recognize them. The nights brought only brief snatches of sleep. Sentry duty alternated with periods of readiness, and at dawn the risk of an attack grew. So we stood and watched in ones and twos. Ghosts, shadows. We could hardly take in the other's face. The flares plucked us out of the darkness, dipped us into their Bengal lights for seconds at a time, suspending their harsh white, golden yellow, pale green, or blood-red fires over the motionless scene of forest edge and trench, and as they went out, they plunged us back into primal night. Fogs lolled over the tawny yellow grass. Every shrub turned into a menacing phantom. The stalks loomed gigantically and became approaching enemies in the wind. After midnight, the waning moon climbed over the horizon, red and around over the floor of fog, as if blood were being squeezed from the hills. Gradually it swelled up like a pumpkin mask, while the night turned into a magic stage for the quiet gathering and dispersing of the silvery clouds. Other nights shone with breadth and starry clarity. Orion and Vega, the Wain, Pisces and Gemini, and the shimmering ribbon of the Milky Way revolved calmly and endlessly around the pole star, indifferent to war and peace on this planet. Below them, luminous bursts of tracer streaked hither and thither. The beauty and lostness of the firmament were of no concern to us. Dead-tired, freezing, yearning, powerless soldiers on sentry duty, we were here to kill. Machine guns hammered briefly and thinly. A shell struck. That was all that mattered in our world. Full moon, the bright nights of the Russian north. The no-man's land lay charmed in the white glare and sheen, and the night became a magical day. We could see across almost as far as the Russian lines. Mist rose, the cold sniffed us out, and the dream god carried us all home. Dawn brought a sacred lull. Daybreak occurred like a relieving dream. The beauty of those hours was worth nights of fear and travail. Some of those dangers and difficulties shook and confused us. The feeling of existence strengthened through time and suffering, and an orbic enthusiasm carried us through deadly hours. In the midst of death we knew. We are. The sun went down in apocalyptic colours. Every scene became precious because it was between goodbye and return home. Night passed, and like a dawn, a new, ever more miraculous return lay behind all our adventurous wanderings. One night, going back to the dugout with food, we lost our way. We leapt over a collapsed trench into no man's land and ran on as far as the Russian wires. But then we found our way unmolested and looked back on our reckless undertaking as on a kind of comedy. The night frosts grew colder, the earth froze, and sometimes we caught the scent of rime and snow in the air. Autumn was coming to an end. The second winter campaign in Russia was beginning. We withdrew our anti-tank gun from the trench. We lugged it back across trenches and no man's land. One man was wounded. A horse died the next day. Another position, less exposed, farther away from the enemy, took us in. Life went on, but death remained our daily bread. Not far from the fairy tale wood, our bunker lay in a bomb crater. Low vegetation poked bare stalks across the saps, and all around the bleak steppe spread its expanse. We watched through the nights, digging under a sickle moon. The fireworks of flares played away in the distance, and we were glad to be dwelling in greater security. Our combativeness had long since been transmuted into a meek endurance. We made ourselves as comfortable as we could in the limited space. The bunker was warm and offered a bench and a table and enough room to sleep. We didn't need more than that. With brandy, hot lemonade and toast, we had ourselves the small joys of life. The front became restless. At night there was a crashing and rattling in the trenches, there were flashes everywhere, and we grew anxious. But before long, calm returned. Days of bright sunshine followed, of an unbelievable luminosity that only the Russian winter could produce over the frozen landscape. We found frozen daisies, tiny blue stars of blossom and withered leaves. Frost breathed over the land, and we sat by the stove. The wood crackled, the flames danced, the wind sang in the stovepipe, and outside the stars wheeled by. After midnight there was profound darkness. The skies were occluded by thick clouds. A strong breeze got up, and then the snow whirled over the plain. The yellow grasses and woods lay there in white flecks and streaks, filled up the hollows, and gradually converted the land. A yellow-grey sky gaped down. With staring eyes we looked about us. As long as we stayed awake, our souls could not die. The winter remained mild for a long time. We were kitted out with woolens and padded suits against snow and cold. Felt boots arrived, and the soldier's life was easier to bear. Pale sky, details of snow work on branches and grass, glittering hoarfrost in the morning light, and quiet on the front. We loved the world when it was like that. My comrades were dispatched to Olinin, where the Russians were trying hard to make a breakthrough. They froze, were wounded, but had to hold out. They suffered from frostbite, lived in dugouts in the snow, without any stoves, and returned weeks later half-starved, sick and ghostly, a clutch of survivors from dire necessity. I stayed behind on my own, armed only with a pistol, to guard the bunker and keep order. So, in the middle of my second winter campaign, I was living a kind of hermit's life. I chopped wood and burned it, brewed myself coffee, wrote and sang to myself. The only time I ever saw a fellow human being was when I was getting food. By the light of a candle or oil lamp, I sat at the table, listened to the humming and crackling of the little stove, stared into the dying embers or the flickering dance of flames, dreamed, and killed time. From time to time, I received visits from some other solitary, and we told each other about our lives in peacetime, our war postings, and our hopes. We stared out into the driving snow, and on quiet days walked beside the trenches, as though through a miniature glacier world. Everything that had appeared so important outside sank in my inner peace. It was only in my heart that the fullness of pictures and dreams lived on. I was living from stocks laid down in the distant past. There were no revelations, but light and falling snow. Flickering of fire and moonlight became events to me. I lived like a hermit all alone in space, far from the war and the noisy bustle of the world. Dusk. I pulled on my camouflage suit, picked up my mess tin and field bottle, raised the sheet away from the entrance, and stepped outside. A blizzard was racing over the plain. It almost took the breath away from my mouth. A dense veil of dancing, whirling, tumbling flakes enwrapped me, and the sharp wind cut into my face like a razor. Through the grey-white whirling and seething, I couldn't see the sky, and the blanket of snow deepened incessantly. Only for a few steps could I make out the ground underfoot, a tree, a shrub. I struck out in the approximate direction of the church and leaned into the howling storm. It blew over the land with the hooting and whining of a foghorn. I had been walking for a long time, struggling on, bathed in sweat, and still hadn't reached the path to the church defile. At last I did encounter a track, but it wasn't one I knew. I had never been here before. I crossed it, and the dusk tipped blue and murky grey inks into the chasing white. I hurried so as not to be late, and suddenly saw a wood by my side, a low stand of trees. Not a forest, not the familiar fairy tale wood. I must have slipped through a space between the trenches into no man's land. I felt uncertain and turned back. The snow had wiped out my footprints, and space seemed to blur in the half-light. I no longer knew which way to turn. The foghorn boomed in my ear incessantly. I hit the road again, and this time followed it. No traces of truck or sleigh traffic marked it. I reached another piece of wood and heard the slow ticking of Russian machine guns. Then a hail of bullets clattered past me. I dropped to the ground, took the safety off my pistol. I crept back, went down the road the other way, and encountered a shot-up armoured car. But there were many like that. Nearby I saw the ruins of a village, not Tabakovo, not Pondarovo. I looked in vain. I shouted into the din, ran in circles, stopped, panting, stood there exhausted, helpless, full of uncertainty and fear in the night. It had gotten dark, and the snowstorm didn't let up. I gave up the pointless enterprise, crawled into the armoured car, lit a cigarette, and decided to wait for day to break or the storm to blow over. Indifferent to the danger and dog-tired, I fell asleep. Awakening after midnight, I stood trembling and reeling on the street. The blizzard had let up. I found a telephone line and followed it. It took me to the ravine, and from there I soon found my way back. I got to the bunker exhausted, lit a fire, ate a piece of old bread and lay down. But I was unable to sleep for many hours. The foghorn howled in my ears, and I was glad when the day arrived. When I awoke, I was snowed in. The early light was dimmed. A thick wall of snow had buried me. My comrades came calling and dug me out. The fairy tale forest stood there all peacefully, the hills white. White coats draped the firs, the white bunkers and trenches. There were no tracks in the virginal snow. And yet the demons of this landscape were persecuting me, filling my soul with icy silence and a fatalism that made me hold on and endure like grass and tree. But perhaps they were doing their bit to assimilate the inner man to his fate, to enable him to suffer the inhuman. My contemplative hermit life continued. One night the snow creaked from cautious footsteps. I heard Russian spoken, and I clutched my pistol at the ready. But the patrol failed to spot the snowed-in entrance and went on its way. And then I left the snowy wastes. In the fairy tale forest, a subterranean city was coming into being. Bunker lined up by the side of bunker, all down the road. Just as into the last house on the edge of the world, I moved in with a mortar unit facing the enemy, to serve as a machine gunner against shock troops and scouts. We lived in plenty of space and warmth, were given plenty of food, put out few sentries, and were allowed enough sleep. This was where I celebrated Advent Sunday, the time of preparation. Usually on the qui-vive, I now settled in to wait for the promise to be redeemed. A presentiment of terrible events alternated with high spirits and moodiness. I acquired more confidence and calmly remembered the previous year's Advent. The Russians assembled reinforcements opposite us. An increased stage of alert was ordered. It began to thaw. The snow melted and dribbled down the walls of the trenches. The earth softened, and meltwater soaked our boots and made the felt heavy and cold. The bare trees stared into chill grey days, and the ice cracked in the fishing pond. Russian deserters brought news of a planned attack, and we were on the alert. For 4 days and 3 nights we had no sleep, always in our heavy winter tunics. The stove remained lit, sweat ran down our foreheads, and in the icy draught our feet froze. The cold applied its wolf's teeth again, but the drips continued to fall from the ceiling of the bunker. Vainly we put out tarpaulins. Whatever we touched was damp and mired. Our trousers and coats were clammy. Our pallets were covered with clumps of mud. We waited, choked down our mouldy bread, and nothing happened. Alert. Our weapons froze. The shoes sat on our feet like a layer of ice, alert, equally prepared to die or flee. It mattered little whether it was a Russian bullet that brought us down or our own barrage, which would probably be levelled at our positions, whether we broke down on the road and died of exhaustion or froze to death on sentry duty in the endless nights. 1 hour, and we lost all sensation in our hands and feet. A second, and the body shook as in fever, trembled, shook, deadened. 3 hours, and the blood slowed, dreams came, and suddenly the relief brought the half-demented sentry back to ghastly life. We thawed out, stared at one another, a ghostly ring of 7 deathly pale soldiers, discoloured by bunker fug, smoke and soot, with wild hair and desperate eyes, tormented by lice. In our mess tins, remnants of food decomposed. We hid all clocks. Time didn't move. Waiting became a torment. It wore us out. Everything lost meaning and purpose, and we longed for the relief of conflict. A wounded man was sent back bandaged up with paper. Men went missing. We had to hold out. We were soldiers and the pioneers of a great new age that we didn't believe in. Everything passed. Before long, night darkened over the battlefield, and the tracks of wolves multiplied in the snow. Decomposition took us in its loving caress. We dreamed of youth before the war stole it from us, pictured our unlived lives yearningly to ourselves. There was a night that was full of drinking, singing, dancing, kissing, and there were 1,000 others full of music, magic, ecstasy, laughter, dreaming, walking, and blissful sadness. But they were never ours. We saw the snow. God had made it, as He had made us. We thought of home, the books we had to burn along with their lies. We had to go home, bolt the doors, view as from a distance the decline of the West, and strangle our sons, the instant their mothers had given birth to them, so that there would be no more war in this world. Life was great, Advent, and the Saviour at hand. Already the Russian munitions factories were filling shells with our names on them. We added to the number of birch crosses with steel helmets dangling on them where men who had been turned into beasts rotted away. That was the accomplishment of this war, and so we plunged into despair. Gallows humour failed us. This suffering was proof against irony, and we merely laughed in the grinning face of our misery. Fiendish grimaces flowered on the dungy bed of our Advent. We could stand to wait in our bunker no longer. As soon as day broke, we hurried out to the edge of the fairy tale forest. Fresh snow had fallen, and we could see down the long slope to the fishing pond. In front of us stretched the demonic landscape of war. Fog in dense swathes lifted out of the gully and masked the coniferous heights opposite with dim haze. The plain faded away into the distance with the grey, pale, reddish evening sky. Blue-white shadows and yellow lights played over the snow. There was no one in sight, no animal, no word, no bird call. Only the bunkers, slowly emitting white smoke from their wet wood fires, which mounted in frozen strips over the valley, as though ghostly blacksmiths were pouring the bullets for the coming battle. Slowly we headed back into the fairy tale forest. Snow had fallen overnight, lay thick and soft on the ground, and the branches bore its mild weight. Beautiful and silent, the wood contrasted with the foggy ground in the early light. Abruptly, the great symphony of war struck up and surged over it. We heard the detonations of the Russian artillery, bounced forward from the hills behind their lines. The shells exploded way back in our hinterland. The echo thundered, compounded itself into an elemental roar, and went on resounding like a choir of ghosts. Then the first impacts were heard in the little wood. Artillery shells burst with dull thumps. Tank rounds and anti-tank munitions came whistling and howling, and blew up with shrill crashes. Mortar shells plummeted down without notice. In between, machine guns were threading their deadly nets. The salvos of Russian smoke projectors came drumming toward us. There was an incessant shrieking, rumbling, whistling, howling and droning that swelled into a storm and went under in an endless rolling thunder, in which we couldn't distinguish the individual discharges and explosions. This was drum fire. We sat in the bunker fully dressed with our weapons at the ready. 2 layers of beams and a few shovelfuls of earth were all that protected us, and still it felt like a relief from the crippling stiflement of waiting. The battle was underway, and the fighting couldn't be any worse than this overture. The bunker trembled and shook. Calmly we looked out into the fury, into fire, flying clumps of earth and smoke. Black dust fountained up vertically and came spattering down. A rain of splinters and frozen clay came down outside the door. Grey-brown, yellowish-black, and pale grey swaths of gunpowder smoke blew by. The vapour scraped our lungs and stung our eyes. As suddenly as it had begun, the raging terror ended, passing farther into our hinterland. The telephone lines were shredded, no runners dared go out, but we knew. At this very moment, the first wave of Russians would be charging against the trenches in front of us. We hurried to the mortar, rigged up the machine gun, and saw them coming, in white winter camouflage, in groups and lines. Defensive fire began. We saw them fall, falter, and flee. An hour passed. The second wave also broke under our combined machine gun, infantry artillery, and mortar fire. Then night started to fall. The dead lay a long way in front of us. The wounded crawled back. Our wounded were carried to the doctor. It was eerily quiet, except for the occasional shot, like a delayed echo of the noise of the day. By now the fairy tale forest had undergone a transformation. The snow was no longer white, rather it was covered with a crust of powder slime, trodden underfoot, mixed with dust, shrapnel, and earth, all of which meant that the once white forest floor gave off nothing more than an uncertain ghostly glimmer in the early evening. The wood itself seemed to have been partially cleared. Piles of uprooted trees lay about. Shell crater was planted by shell crater, and the shells had sheared the frozen branches off the trunks. Shredded and broken, the damaged branches stretched out, the bark lacerated by shrapnel. The firs were bare torsos, robbed of their smashed needled twigs. The beauty and life of the wood had fallen victim to the war, just like all the dead and wounded all about. We survivors, though, loved the danger, which we preferred to the murderous waiting around. In this battle of materiel, life proved itself to be the stronger in its orgiastic desire to be. The war conducted us into a dreamy place, and men who otherwise were perfectly peaceable characters felt a secret yearning for horrid feats of endurance and arms. The primal man awoke in us. Instinct replaced intellect and feeling, and a transcendent vitalism adopted us. But now we returned to our bunker sobered, exhausted, and frozen. That night the weapons spoke once more. There was a dialogue of machine guns, bickering from trench to trench. On sentry duty we listened. Foggy, snow-bright nights with flares burning out high up in the haze, giving us mute ghosts some human traits. Here a German machine gun called out to the enemy in rapid, dry stabs of fire that we were there, waiting and alert, and then the calmer ticking of a Russian one replied after a short interval, or spoke up as our weapon fell silent. The fugal echo of the bullets was heard a while longer. This was a concert of technical orchestras, of mechanical instruments played upon by their victims. Metal ruled. Grass and trees had to suffer as much as humans. The following day heard a noisy anarchy of warring voices, pell-mell the fire of artillery, smoke projectors, tank guns and mortars. The last attacks faltered in front of our wire entanglements. By evening it was over. We counted the fallen in front of our lines and picked out our dead and wounded, named names whose bearers were no longer alive. Almost unmoved, without regret, like mere statistical data, from which we passed on to the duties of the day. One member of our platoon had received a direct hit. We picked up his limbs from the blood-crusted snow, scraped the mass of flesh and guts together, and sprinkled earth over brains and blood. What was left, almost weightless, we wrapped in canvas and buried outside Tabakovo, as if the material war had turned us into soulless machines. Many times the dead could find no rest either. They lay there for weeks sometimes in summer, decomposing in cornfields while the blowflies grubbed around in their eyes, till someone found them, and a burial commando sheeted them, loaded up the slimy mass, and buried it in a war cemetery for fallen heroes. In this way, even the graves outside Tabakovo were dug up, and the remains buried elsewhere. There they rested in peace, and their deeds in everlasting renown. Afterward, we were finally allowed to sleep. A few collapsed into almost unconscious exhaustion. The rest of us remained awake. Each time we nodded off, the shells whined into our consciousness and shook us awake, and in the silence outside, the roar of memory seemed to be amplified. We were still swaying along the bridge between life and death. Time and time again I relived those minutes when I lay unprotected in a crater, and the drum fire flared up around, ploughed the crater rim, and dumped snow and dirt on me till I blacked out. My comrades dug me up, carried me to a bunker, and thought I was dead. When I awoke, it was as though I had come from another world. Because we were living in close proximity to death, there was nothing difficult about dying. It was the hesitancy and ubiquitousness of death that made him so great and terrible. His favourites were not those who were long spared, but those who died swiftly. Us, though, he was transforming season by season. He conducted us through the secret chambers of the soul, awoke the angel in the good man and the spirits of Cain in the bad. He filled us and peeled us. He caused us to bear fruit, and from a drop of bitter wormwood he made a whole sea of desperation. In this way he grew over us as a victorious tree. Like a shadow, he set himself up in front of the weak, plunged him into the laughter of despair, awoke feverish lust for life and excess, quenched the last fires of renunciation and goodness, reverence and faith, ripped off his mask and let him fall like rotten carrion. Some men inclined to death like ripe fruit. The much-travelled wanderer was only too willing to drop anchor in his Hades, and the preparing for it made him happy. Death was almost like a light from within. There was no spirit world for him to wreck, and his delay crowned time. In his nearness, all values were revised. Gold was vanity, while every piece of bread became precious. Books shallowed or found deeper meaning. Love affairs found their completion or their trickling away. Only what was essential survived. In this way, death made us into new and better people. Birch crosses told the tale of that winter. Sand slowly slipped through the hourglass, and every grain rested in God's hands. We had no sense of that. We experienced the beginning of the new year still in the fairy tale forest, celebrated New Year's Eve with brandy and bold talk, and at midnight put on a fireworks display from all our weapons at once. 1943. A drunken walk followed, a sleigh ride, and we slept in late. But at the sight of the beheaded trees, the bare shrubs, that not even the hoarfrost, the visible soul of delicacy, was able to touch with life. Amid all the wreckage of beauty and peace, we were regularly overcome by the feeling that all this was leading just such an unreal, spectral life as we ourselves. Then, out of nowhere, the name Ghostwood cropped up, and before long it was everywhere. We were like ghosts ourselves. Shelling and fighting had passed over our heads and uprooted us like the fir trees. Our masks of needles and leaves had been stripped off us by the war. Spiritually, we were just as torn and disfigured as the foliage after the battle. We were incapable of thinking anything beyond shells, detonations, explosions, black snow, blood, death. Later on, that black snow would symbolize for us the ravages the war had wrought in our young souls. Only a sheer hoarfrost veneer of toughness and danger and the fresh snow of silence concealed these wounds, till the last of us fell in the frost. Piece by piece of our being broke off, and we became shadows of our former selves. We wanted to forget the past and bury it, yet we couldn't. We started rootling about in it once more, and freighted the urns of our dreams with what we had seen. An iron frost set in, as though a polar wind were blowing down from the stars. The white moon glowed more harshly down from the whirl of the clouds. Our hands and feet couldn't get warm. We suffered from persecution mania. Surrounded by death, we passed through these days, taking our leave. In the midst of death we lived, we turned the commonplace on its head. We learned to hate our time and to curse the war. But within we still resisted the idea that all sacrifice was futile, so as not to fall into the despair of the soldier in an exposed, hopeless position. The fighting was over, but it was only now that everything became real. Only now did we see how inhuman all our experience had been and try to give it some meaning and value. But reality compelled us to put away our cherished illusions. A spiritual struggle against reality began. But we found no magic word, no new illusion. Pitilessly, the war fitted into the microcosm of our world picture. The snow lasted, the nights remained full of silence, as though everything were just a dream. If we discovered any human feeling in our hearts, God's smile seemed to blow about our brows. We started believing again in better worlds that were being born out of defeat and no man's land, and when we closed our eyes, images of home came toward us like a column of pilgrims, dipped in syrupy light. One day, even the dreams of soldiers would have to become lived life. We came with empty hands, but one day everything would be accomplished. We asked questions and pondered. We weren't living in a great time, even though many things happened in giant dimensions. Like the atoms of a storm, we passed through shocks and catastrophes and dreamed of the decline of the West as it tore itself to shreds. We participated in the tragedy. It was the triumph of the machine over man and God. The magnitude of the battles of steel and high explosives, the vast scale of undertakings, the exertions of material and strength in planetary space. This violence was undeniable, but it wasn't technology, but spirit and intellect that made a period great. Our own greatness was nothing but a dementia. Less than a scrap of steel, a man stood between unfettered forces, a cipher, a weapon, and an obedient body, servant to a machine. We didn't want to be like that, but we preferred to give ourselves to the chance of a battle, the mockery of a soldier's hazard, than to the certain death of law. Whether we were courageous or trembling, bold or cowardly, grimly prepared or frantic as we went into battle, nothing weighed as anything compared with the fact that none of us went voluntarily. Only occasionally, on the brink of madness, was there the heroic sacrifice of an individual who had lost belief in his own life. We were soldiers, dulled beings, vegetating in trenches and bunkers, wasting our time without hope, bragging, swearing, worrying, enduring, obeying, dehumanized caricatures. It was very rare for any humanity to show itself in war, and if an isolated individual wanted to write and read and study, then there was a fight for a candle. Light was needed only for eating and for keeping watch, but not for the mind. War struck us as a necessity, as a divine commandment, a cosmic happening, purposing the completion and annihilation of the individual. But now we saw that war wasn't made for gods and men, that only ignorance could start an avalanche that would engulf everything. No victory, no conquest justified a single death, a man starved, frozen, lacerated, a single orphaned child. All war wanted was itself, and so we came to understand where our willingness had gotten us, and we remembered the heroic nihilism with which we had once set out from Jaroslaw. Now we humans could survive in inhumanity and love the intoxication and beauty of destruction, praise the shards of our own destinies, adore carrion, and give it our yes. But we didn't. We had been mistaken. We were the playthings of history and probabilities. Who were we? Just as our winter gear ended up leaving only our eyes uncovered, so soldierliness left minimal room for the expression of human traits. We were in uniform, not just unwashed, unshaved, lousy and sick, but also spiritually ravaged, nothing but a sum of blood, guts and bones. Our comradeship was made from mutual dependence, from living together in next to no space. Our humour was born out of sadism, gallows humour, satire, obscenity, spite, rage and pranks with corpses, squirted brains, lice, pus and shit, the spiritual zero. Our stir-craziness in our bunker set little blooms of wit sprouting from the manure of need. Philosophy, ethics and thought were replaced by self-preservation. We had no faith to sustain us, and philosophy served only to make our lot appear a little more bearable. The fact that we were soldiers was sufficient basis for criminality and degradation, for an existence in hell. Our totems were self, tobacco, food, sleep, and the whores of France. We didn't matter. Hunger, cold, spotted fever, diphtheria and frostbite, cripples and cadavers, bombed villages, looted cities, freedom and peace certainly didn't matter. Least of all did the individual human being matter. We could die unconcerned. Willie Peter Rees, aged 2 in 1923, Willie with a cousin, 1925. Burning the midnight oil, circa 1935. A student in the Mercator Secondary School, Duisburg. Willie is second from the right in the second row. Testimonials from Willie's classmates in their commemorative magazine. Willie as the proud high school graduate, with his mother, with his father. Vacationing in Prepau on the Dars, circa 1937. To please his father, Willie joined a bank. His traineeship came to a premature end when he was drafted in 1941, on the exercise ground in the Eifel, June 1941. Willie is standing, fourth from the right. Postcard to his mother, January 15, 1943. On a scrap of paper, Willie keeps a note of the address of a Jewish friend in Auschwitz. It reads, Rolf N., prisoner in protective custody, born 12/11/1920, number 115613, Block 2A, Auschwitz concentration camp, Upper Silesia, Post Office 2. In the jungle of Bryansk, Russia, in summer 1943. Willie is on the far left, going east and west, respectively, in a drawing accompanying the letter of July 12, 1943. Attempt at a self-portrait, July 20, 1943. Willie, with his unit, standing extreme left. The military hospital in Oberhof, Thuringia, March 1943. Letter to his parents, New Year's Day, 1944. The freezing winter of 1944 in Russia, marching toward the Smolensk, Minsk log road, trying to get warm on the forest's edge at Selez. A typescript page of Willie's war book. The Beautiful She-Devil, a poem by Willie Peter Rees, April 18, 1944. Red Cross missing persons form from 1970. The balance of probability is that Willie Peter Rees met his end in the course of the fighting in the Vitebsk area sometime between June 22nd and 30th, 1944. Snowstorms came. We left the Ghostwood and moved into the trenches and bunkers of the fishing pond, a wide gully that a creek flowed through, swamp sluggish and deep in snow. Tight caverns took us in. There was no more firewood, no more candles. It was a punishment transfer. The snowstorm foamed over hills and plains as we made our move through waist-deep snow with a sleigh, hour upon hour, panting, wheezing, cursing, and finally wearied to death. Powerless and with tears of rage, we lay in the snow, struggling to breathe. Ice crystals lashed our faces. At midnight, snow-blind and on all fours, we reached our objective. We threw our blankets on the pallets of the unheated bunker and fell into a death-like sleep. For 1 hour. Then an order sent us back out into the pitchy night. We were to clear a sap. We dug till daybreak and watched as snow kept blowing over what we had cleared. Our felt boots got wet and ripped. Snow melted on our bare feet. We staggered back to our bunker as the Russians began to shoot at us, had to saw and chop wood, make fires, and then we wanted to sleep. But we got no rest. After not many hours we had to fetch munitions and equipment, and the day declined after long miles weighed down by boxes, spades, and mortar shells. We missed the path and plunged into the creek, crawled back on firm ground, and stumbled into the bunker. We changed into boots and were sent out into the unfamiliar terrain, ran around in circles, ended up in a minefield, and fell over a tripwire. An explosion knocked us to the ground, but we remained unhurt. Late and unsuccessful, we found our way back to our bunker and were sent from there, without food, to the main resistance line. We reached it by the light of flares, our hands gauntleted in frozen gloves, our boots frozen. 7 hours we stood sentry, 7 more hours in readiness in a bunker where there was no fire, where the snow lay a foot deep, and we shuddered with cold till we had to go out again, with frozen boots on our rigid feet, standing around on walls of snow without any cover, while a storm of ice needles, damp, flakes, and hailstones battered our faces and clothes. That was the first night. In the morning we were given food and were allowed 4 hours' sleep. A week went by. The cold came back, and the fresh snow froze over. Now we alternated at night. Some nights we stood sentry for 3 hours and dug for 5, to keep the trenches, bunkers, and firing positions free from snow. On others we stood guard in the sap straight through, reeling, freezing, exhausted, and feverish with helpless rage. The snowstorm came again with unexampled force. When we left the bunker that night, we could see neither ground nor sky in the blackish-grey turbulence. A grey void. We couldn't find any path and groped our way along the gully, creeping, losing our footing, and tumbling into the creek. The ice broke. The water went up past our knees, our arms were wet, and we kept on sinking. No one could hear our cries for help. Then we found firm ground, worked our way forward a step at a time, and pulled ourselves ashore. We spent another hour looking, and then we found our trench. We borrowed dry socks and gloves and went on watch. 4 lots of 2 hours. We stood on a high ridge of snow. The storm howled, raged, and battered at us from all directions at once, drove snow in our faces and pushed the flakes through every chink in our battered snowsuits. We were sodden. We could barely make out the flares in the dark. After our relief, we groped our way to the bunker, pulled off our frozen tunics and set them down, wrapped blankets over our shoulders, and smoked with rigid fingers. No stove, knee-high snow, the wind chasing through the broken door. Our hands and feet refused to get warm. We fell asleep sitting. 3 more lots of 2 hours on watch, and then we went back through the still raging storm to our own bunker. We had to spend 2 more hours sawing wood, light the stove with wet kindling, make coffee, and then we were given permission to sleep. 5 hours, and then the next digging detail. But when we were awakened, we were blind. The blizzard had inflamed our eyes, as though they were scratched slides. Our lids red and swollen, everything distorted, our eyes sore and teary. We had to stay awake. So we wrote letters without seeing what we were writing. Only the thought of peace and our mothers kept us from killing ourselves. We cursed God. This exceeded what a man could take. We were desperate. There was no end in sight. The following morning I had made up my mind. In the harsh sunlight I crawled out of the bunker and stood up. 1 bullet whistled by, the second hit. That was salvation. I crawled back into the bunker and got myself bandaged up. The wound in my right thigh didn't bleed much and wasn't very painful. The thought that I might be saved from the hell of the fishing pond meant that I gladly took the shock and the slight stinging. The sun was still gleaming over hoarfrost and snow. I had to wait till dusk before I could go to a doctor. Happily, and as it were with one long sigh of relief, I sat on my pallet. My eyes grew clear again, and I wrote the glad news home and to my friends. Then I packed up my writing things, soap, towel, and books. That was all I took with me. Propped on the shoulder of a comrade, I dragged myself to the doctor in the blue light of evening, was given a tetanus injection, and waited for a sleigh to take me to the main aid station in Charitonovo, to the golden sounds of a Mozart symphony on the wireless. A medical orderly took me on his arm like a child and carried me to the sleigh. The horses trotted through the clear night. Flares glimmered up at ever-increasing distances over the forests. The snow crunched under the sleigh runners, and a meteor plunged to earth. Home. My immobile feet froze, my wound burned, but I didn't attend to pain or cold. Going home. In Charitonovo, the doctor cleaned out the rim of the wound and made an incision between entry and exit wound. He took off my boots and had my frozen feet massaged. The pain abated. Blood flowed through my limbs again, and blissfully I sank into a long, wonderful and dreamless sleep. In the morning, a heated sleigh brought me to Atinovo. I was deloused and sent to a barracks, was carried into treatment on a stretcher, was supplied with brandy and cigarettes, and drank and slept through this night also. I was awakened early, driven to Popino, and loaded onto a hospital train to Vyazma. Sitting up in a passenger train, I rode west, via Smolensk and Vitebsk to Dunaburg, where, more on account of my exhausted appearance than the gravity of my wound, a kindly doctor furnished me with a pass home. Going home. The next evening the train pulled into Virbalen. We were taken off in pouring rain, but the rain seemed to me a consoling miracle after months in the ice and snow. I checked my small luggage and my uniform to be deloused. Nurses took off my bandages. We were bathed and sent to a waiting room to wait for our clothes and get bandaged up. I sat in a room with 200 naked soldiers with frostbite on their hands and feet, bullet wounds all over their bodies, shrapnel everywhere, swellings, and a few, not many, with mental illnesses. 2 doctors and 2 nurses applied bandages in this depot of human misery produced by the war. The doctors did duty for a week at a stretch. The nurses changed daily, since even the hardest hearts and the strongest nerves couldn't stand more of that pussy, rotting, bleeding chaos of pain, devastation, and screams. I saw flesh fall from dead toes and pale bones glimmer through the putrescence, ichor dribble out of festering wounds, faces disfigured by tumours, dead skin hanging in ribbons from burn wounds, and the stumps of amputated arms and legs sticking out grotesquely and spectrally from bloodless trunks. One soldier held out the stump of his right arm to the elder of the 2 doctors. The surgical swabs were still in it, grown over in the course of days without medical attention. The doctor tugged at them with his pincers, and the soldier looked aside. There was dread in his eyes. He groaned and then screamed aloud like a helpless animal, a long, drawn-out, tormented, agonizing wail. The doctor's hands shook, sweat beaded on his brow. In vain he tried to come up with soothing words. Helplessly the young nurse stroked the soldier's hair and mopped the sweat on his deathly pale face. Slowly he slipped to the ground. His unconsciousness touched us all in the manner of a gift. I took refuge in a cigarette. The doctor hurriedly bandaged him up and left. Whoever had seen this and dared to speak just one single word in favour of this war was no human. He was worse than a criminal. It was a relief to me to breathe the cool, silent air of night as, propped on a stick, I walked to a barracks to wait for the onward transport. I travelled via Dresden 33 to Oberhof Hospital in Thuringia. I was at home. Hills clad with evergreen forests and the last of the winter's snow, valleys with rivers swollen by meltwater, simple houses and smooth roads outside the window of my room, which I shared with good comrades. My wound began to hurt. The stresses of the journey had inflamed it. My leg swelled up. One evening I was lying in bed with a high temperature. I was reading a fantastic book, and its barely understood events mingled in my half-sleep with memories of the white hell of the fishing pond, the ghost wood, long-forgotten adventures in the endless Russian expanses, the dead and dying, childhood dreams and celebrations, women, and the vision of Virbalen. By the time the fever broke, I was utterly exhausted. I read, wrote, and slept. Before long I had no peace and no way back into myself. Memories tracked me like furies. I kept reliving the terrors of the winter campaign, hearing the howling of shells and the screams of the wounded, saw soldiers charge and fall and myself like a stranger in my destiny on the edge of no man's land. I sensed the ravages the war had wrought in me, saw the overgrown gardens of my boyhood, and knew I was condemned to a shadow life in the witch's cauldron of memory. I felt abandoned by God and his angels, left out in a vast cosmos, swinging in the void between distant stars. My pondering and self-scrutiny revolved unceasingly around the war. Carrion and horror had become my element. I was a soldier, a wicked warrior, a living corpse, a stranger among happy men, indifferent among the grieving, as incapable of happiness and grief as of pity and love. My intellectual world was sinking, and there was only death dancing on its ruins. An illusory existence among lies and masks was all that remained to me. And this was what the war had made of my life. I remained silent. When I was allowed to get up, I found neither peace nor oblivion, even on long walks in the wooded hills of early spring, and when I lost the ability to sleep at night, I sought refuge in wine and finally found help in morphine. It brought me only a leaden sort of sleep, and when I woke, despair, memories, and emptiness took possession of me again. It was only from new experiences and contacts that I hoped for a cure and a turn in my fortunes. I was released and came home. I read, but no book offered me any signs or portents. I wrote, but words and thoughts were a colourless, formless tangle. I listened to Brahms's Requiem. For all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of grass. The grass is withered, and the flower fallen away. Music did nothing but multiply my grief for a lost world. Gradually I did learn to forget and found some hope again. I travelled to Lake Constance, and there, finally, all the past sank in the fleeting happiness of a love affair. A new life, a new adventure began, and if all these beginnings remained just an embassy from a better, kinder world, even that was something. And when it was over, I was able to say a quiet goodbye. It had to be. Life went on. The Russian Wandering. Travelling into summer life went on. My return home had become a sort of flight into experience. It was only in parties, amours, travels, and events that, like an adventurer, I could find some meaning for my life, overcome the war within me, or at least hide it under a thin layer of varnish. And so I volunteered for the front. I wanted to fight fire with fire and war with war. I cried out for wanderings, sufferings, hardships, and the wide world, so as to slough off my introspection, to compel life by living it. I challenged my destiny to single combat. I brought with me no affirmation, no readiness, and no hope. I threw myself away, because I had lost my belief in mind and spirit, and because not even love could change me or fulfill me. In Russia, I had to gather together the stray pieces of myself. There my trajectory must reach an end, either the making or the destroying of me. And so I saved for myself the last freedom that remains to the soldier, the embers in the ashes, to choose early and of my own free will the lot that I couldn't escape in any case. No heroic nihilism, no belief in the ineluctable, and no faith in God went with me. It was purely as a wanderer and an adventure-seeker that I set out this time. I was a little crazy as I awaited the moment of departure. I drew a line under my life, wrote to thank my beloved, drank once more in the circle of my friends, spent one further night at home, and travelled along the Rhine, as if I had already caught a whiff of the great adventure. Electrical storms were suspended over the landscape. The journey began. I left behind the bombed cities of home, the wreckage of my youth, and I stood to for the command of the hour. We celebrated the departure with wine and champagne, and at midnight I was travelling drunkenly through the unlit shapes of my hometown, buildings enjoying no more than a shadowy existence, sacrificed to the war, ruins of past felicity. I wanted to embrace my destiny and my ruin. Secretly I was hoping for a further return home, because I did want to live out my youth and my yearning, but I agreed to die if that was what the stars had in mind for me. Slowly the train rumbled eastward. Lodz, Warsaw, Orsha, Smolensk. I drank day and night, brandy, vodka, gin. I was barely ever sober for more than an hour at a time because then misery gripped me. Dread of what lay ahead took hold of me, and the war reclaimed me. My thoughts strayed over vast areas, and contradictions multiplied. I no longer had any perspective on things. The war had become a divinely ordained purgatory. The only thing that still had any meaning was the quest for God. Everywhere I caught already the putrid smell of irony, and it was only where the edges of things became unclear that the mysteries began. But myself I could not understand. The war had become an insane variant of introspection. I was partly responsible for it, even if I hadn't asked for terror and fear of death. But I was on my way with my fellow penitents, and my life became a sort of legend to myself. In my heart, though, the world no longer made sense, and it was only in drink that the conflicting spirits got along. So I viewed my departure as a comedy, a chaos of contradictions and errors, masquerades of words and pictures, and suddenly the whiff of adventure overcame me again, a divine frivolity that rejected any and all responsibility. I calculated there would be enough time afterward for tears. Once more the vast expanse of Russia lay outside the windows. Grey skies, meadows, scattered trees, rarely a building. It was raining. Hay and grain were rotting away. I slept and drank. In the sunset at Smolensk, I heard women singing. They sang between trains that crossed here, east and west, melancholy, lost in their eerie, cruel, fertile country, and a soil that would not honour any amount of sacrifice. In the moonlit night, horns sounded. There were calls from obscure distances, coming nearer and losing themselves in other distances, a sound full of yearning, fatigue, and homesickness, and yet a romantic greeting, an embassy from life in the enemy land. In the evening we were taken off the train at Yarzevo. We overnighted in a barn and the next day rested at Filipovo. There, after a long time on the road, I saw girls dancing in the evening again. To the monotonous sound of balalaika music, they stepped and twirled in a ring of young men, sometimes sang in soft plaint and spun again in a mute dance, took hands with slow movements, parted them again, and exited the ring with a light bow. Their white headscarves glowed in the sunset and went on gleaming in the rising moon. Distance was reflected on their impassive faces. Crickets chirped in the mournful balalaika noise, and we soldiers sang and laughed with strangers, as if the distant sound of the front were not echoing in the ancient dance. I was happy. In the middle of Russia, I at last felt at home. This was where I belonged. Nowhere other than in this world with its horrors and sparse joys was it good to be. Only here did my soul find its strange element. A thunderstorm was hissing, and pale yellow light crashed through the clouds. A rainbow built its laborious arch over alders, pastureland, and forest clearings. I went into position in Vorotinovo, a village where only ruins were left protruding through the tall grass and profusion of flowers. That was the critical point in our position at Vopez. The Russians were just in front of our trenches, and day and night we traded mortar shells and bombs with them. A wild blooming and sprouting covered our trenches, and the bunker itself disappeared under a pelt of corn and weeds. In spite of that, it felt almost like a skyscraper, the way it loomed out of its slope, and not a few shells whistled hard over our heads and stuck in its upper walls. I had no need to get acclimatized here. This was my house. I wasn't just a guest. Nights we spent digging in the misty landscape, under the moon and stars, till blue-grey dusk. Flares whizzed past, explosive shells hit, sudden assaults of mortars forced us under cover, but the danger didn't frighten us. It soothed me to be remote from everything intellectual and from all the movements of my spirit. Letters helped against the isolation. The muted beauty of the scenery around Vopez was now my life, not the war. Sunrise, the movements of the clouds, dusk and starry nights built a world where I felt cheerfully at home. Nothing but a wanderer, an adventurer, an itinerant student of life, I stared into the nameless face of war. All the powers might be striving for one another's extermination. What manned the trenches barely deserved the name of man. They were more like soulless tools of destruction, fanatics of doom. There was hardly a pause between engagements for the individual man to think of his being made in God's image and the foes to feel their shared fate. Being made a prisoner was a terror, and being wounded in no man's land meant almost certain death. The operation of these elemental forces provided the setting for me to live and be in magic horror, a wanderer between dust and stars in that unhinged time. Death and killing were the only aim of this tussle. There was no conflict of politics or philosophy. Each man was fighting for his life, and no longer for ideals and a delusory meaning. Everything finally devolved to a futile waste of men and material. We stayed there a few more days, bronzed by the July sun. Then orders came that we were to be relieved, and we departed at night. And so began my Russian wanderings. The uncertain tracks of that year began.